Hello, this is Curt Pringle. Thank you for tuning in. Today is another episode of Talking Issues. And really, I wanted to work on these podcasts to really have a discussion with experts in public policy areas that are kind of critical for today. And today's discussion is one of the things that we see in opinion polls all across the country that affect people's lives and affect how they're going to vote and participate. And that really is the issue of crime. And really the question whether crime is growing in terms of its rate and its impact in our society and in our communities. So today I thought it would be good to uh, introduce you to one of my longtime friends who understands this issue very well, Mike Reynolds, a lawyer here at Snell and Wilmer.
Thank you, Kurt. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast and always a pleasure to see you. It's only been a couple of days since we had dinner together, but once again, great to see you.
Well, I didn't have dinner. I just had a drink, but that's okay.
Well, I had dinner and I didn't have a drink.
Well, that's good. Yeah, you were talking that night. But Michael has a unique perspective on this crime issue. And during a time in California's past when criminal justice issues and crime really did influence the voters in 1994 was during the time that the voters were facing the Three Strikes Initiative and whether they wish to take a part in expanding and increasing some of the severity on imprisonment and laws. And the Reynolds family really is the impetus of that law. And maybe you can give a little background of how your family got involved.
So we got involved in the anti-crime crusade, despite having always been, fairly conservative politically. It didn't have, our beliefs weren't really put to the test until we actually had a situation in our family. My sister, 18 years old at the time, in the summer of 1992, was murdered by repeat felons who were on parole. Exactly the kind of people, if you looked at the rap sheet, and you would say, why in the world are these people on parole? Why are they on the street? You can tell based on their criminal history that it's only a matter of time and only a short amount of time before there are additional victims that they will create. So you know that was the genesis of the law. Was in the aftermath of her killing. We said, what can we do to stop this sort of thing from happening so frequently? I don't know I know you're old enough to recall, I'm certainly old enough to recall that in the early 90s, our crime rates had gotten so bad that we got to the point where virtually everybody in the state knew somebody or themselves had been a victim of crime. Whether it was a violent crime or a serious property crime, an auto theft or a home burglary, and people just had it up to here with it. And it was certainly long overdue at that point to change the justice system that had decayed mostly because of reforms that had been made in the 1970s.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, you point out there were so many victims of crime, and a lot of times people who are victim, and we know many people who are, right? Personally, we all know that. And often it is the question, what do they do with that grief, with that challenge, with that understanding of what it is to be a victim? And your family was, and you took that experience and stepped up and really got involved in trying to reform a system that was out of control, certainly in the 90s.
Yeah, and it was amazing how many people we met in the aftermath of my sister's death. That people that had suffered similar losses, and people who had suffered even worse. Had multiple family members gunned down, or so you ask yourself, what can we do to make a difference? What can we do to change things? And this was a state that at the time it seemed like it was hopeless to try and change things. We spent the next year or so after her death drafting up a law. We had some of the smartest people we know would come to my parents' house, and my dad is a fantastic chef. He'd cook for the whole group. and we, ping pong ideas off of each other. Judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors,
All in Fresno. So
all in
you get
Fresno,
together
and
in Fresno.
yeah, and legislators, that would come down to Fresno, and we'd have these big backyard meetings. And the summers in Fresno pretty hot, but my dad's cooking made it worthwhile. But the one of the bits of information we got from Dan Lundgren's office, that really shaped.
Who was the Attorney General at the time?
Yeah, he was correct. Was that 5.9% of the felons were responsible for 60% of the serious and violent felonies. And so, that was a real wake up call, because it certainly wasn't what we had thought.
Yeah, but see, I don't. So I think that number and that statistic is one of those things that is hard for people to comprehend. That they just believe that a lot of crimes are haphazard and people fall into that lifestyle because they're, you know, uh, in anger or frustration with somebody, or they're challenged one way or the other. But in fact, there are people that a relatively small percentage then and today that are responsible for a high percentage of all those crimes.
Correct. And what we also found is that the the criminals don't fall into these little silos or categories of criminals, where you have your petty thieves here, and you have your car burglars here, and you have your car thieves here, and you got your residential burglars here, and your murderers over here. They're all the same people. Now, over the course of a criminal's career, the frequency and severity of the crimes will increase. So, rarely is a criminal's first crime a murder, but it starts off with something, relatively minor, and,
Right.
and turns into that over time.
Right.
But all in
Yeah.
all, the same people.
Yeah, no, and I'll even add, because as I was preparing to talk with you about this today, this morning on the news, they're talking about recidivism in New York City and the crime rates going up and all of the issues that we'll get to in a little while as to why that would happen. But there was a number that said 721 people in the New York system are responsible for 30% of all the crimes in New York City. And I don't know if that's right or if that's wrong, but that's what was said.
I just wonder if de Blasio's on that list.
Yes, well, maybe, but the point is made, as it was in 1994, that it's a relatively small group of people that are the recidivists that are back and commit multiple crimes that just tally up those numbers of criminal actions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we found in that. So we said, look, if we have one arrow in our quiver, if there's one thing that we can, one target we can aim at, what is it? It's got to be the recidivist, because that's where you get the most action. That's where you get the most bang for your buck in terms of criminal justice. Mm-hmm. So we developed this three strikes law, I was at law school at UCLA at the time, and had access to what was then one of the finest law libraries in the world. Now, everybody's got a fine law library on their laptop, but back then it wasn't the case. And we found a couple of other laws in other jurisdictions that were similar. They were three-time loser laws, but they didn't have the sort of reach that we wanted. They focused only on violent crimes. Now, in California, you've got three categories of felonies, and of course, three categories of crime overall. You got infractions, which are really minor. You got misdemeanors, which are relatively kind of in between. And you got felonies. Among felonies, you've got three categories of crimes. You've got your garden variety felonies like grand theft auto, and you've got serious felonies, which are things that are not necessarily violent, but they're extremely dangerous, such as residential burglary. I break into your house at night with the intent to commit a felony within. That has a tremendous likelihood of resulting in a violent felony. And then you've got the violent felonies, which are also defined by statute, and they're fairly self-explanatory.
Yeah, but so I remember the number was a lot smaller than I had thought in that pool of violent felonies.
That's right, because there were a lot of things that you would think would be violent that are serious felonies, but not violent felonies. And we wanted to capture
So you said
both.
grand theft,
Yeah,
auto, which now is, might have been forgiven altogether. But the point is that grand theft was not a serious or violent felony.
that's right. It was a regular felony. And what we said is and remember, at the time that we proposed the three strikes law, back in 1993 is when we finally drafted it and brought it to the legislature. And of course, the legislature threw it out because Willie Brown controlled the Public Safety Committee at the time. But we drafted it so that it would apply to anybody who had 2 or more serious or violent felony convictions. And their third felony, the triggering felony, could be any felony, so long as they had at least 2 serious or violent priors. Our research showed that the average 3-striker for the first couple of years that 3 strikes was was being enforced from 1994 through 1996, the average was 14 serious or violent prior convictions. So
Really?
yeah, because you had this inventory of people who were out there on the streets who had a vast array in their background of serious and violent felonies, who would never have been on the streets had 3 strikes been the law in the 1970s and 1980s.
Those didn't count against them.
Correct.
So I think some people also miss the if you're arrested for a serious and violent felony or things like, I believe, arson and murder and rape and home invasion or home robbery, that might be serious.
Yeah, that's a serious.
But the point is, those violent ones, they're very limited. And so if an individual was arrested and convicted for a rape, they'd go to prison and they would spend time in prison. And then upon completion of their time, they would get out of prison. And if they committed another serious and violent felony, being there and convicted of it, that's their second strike. And they would presumably go to prison and serve that time. So in other words, this isn't something that could be piled up in a weekend. This is really going through that entire process, right?
Well, under the 3 strikes law, no, it could actually. I mean, if you had somebody that went on a crime spree and, let's say they break into your house, okay, so that's your serious felony. And, 30 minutes later, they sexually assault somebody in your house, okay, that's a violent felony. There's two strikes right there. Now, I guarantee you that person has already got a bunch of strikes on the record. That's not their debut with crime. Okay. But hypothetically, we're talking about law school hypotheticals. That was the first time they ever broke the law, was breaking and entering into your house with the intent to commit a felony therein. And 30 minutes later, commit a sexual assault while they're there, or a violent assault on somebody else. It's non-sexual. Okay, they've already got 2 strikes. So then the third strike can be
they steal my car as they leave.
They can steal your car as they leave.
Yeah, exactly. So these are relatively bad guys. Now
you can't. Now you couldn't do lesser included offenses though. That was the thing. So I mean, if you've got somebody who, in the midst of committing an assault and battery, also commits something that's a lesser included offense, those typically would not be considered separate.
Okay,
strikes.
so it is the premise that there has to be multiple criminal
crimes.
Action, maybe on multiple days or whatever the case may be. And you thought the best way to do this is to try to vet it through the legislature and see if the legislature would support it. I was in the legislature at the time, so I certainly understand what was going on.
Well, and we were pretty naive, but we thought, well, we've got bipartisan support. We had Jim Costa, who was our Democrat. We had Bill Jones, who was our Republican.
Both members of the state assembly.
Both members of the state assembly at the time, and Jones later became Secretary of State. Then it got shot down in the Public Safety Committee, which we thought it was ironic that Public Safety would be the name of a committee that was really literally the graveyard for every bill that could possibly enhance public safety.
Yeah, and I don't think I ever told you this story, but it's one of those interesting things to me that people wonder how the legislature works sometime. And the Speaker of the Assembly at that time was Willie Brown. Long before I became Speaker of the Assembly, but the Speaker can determine how many people sit on a committee and who those people are. So that Public Safety Committee at the time had 6 members, 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And the point is, that was not an arbitrary number. That was a precise number for a precise reason, because he put 3 extremely liberal people on the Public Safety Committee, and then 3 liberal Democrats and 1 moderate Democrat, and then 2 Republicans. And you have to have a majority to pass anything. So it was done
so they never get a majority.
It was done that way so that a moderate Democrat could say there are moderate Democrats in the state, and there's a moderate Democrat that voted for this law, but it never got the 4 votes necessary for passage. So the number 6 on that committee was specifically designated for that purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it wasn't arbitrary or a guess, or there might be only 6 people that care about it. No, that's not true.
Well, and you clued us into that, and you clued in John and Ken to that when we were doing the campaign for the ballot initiative about a year later. So when the talk radio hosts were given the moderate Democrats hell for their position, they knew what the game was because you had explained it to us.
Yeah, and it really was in Sacramento that interesting shift when all of a sudden one of these liberal Democrats on the Public Safety Committee got replaced by, I don't know if it was Bob Epple or Tom Umberg. They both were more moderate Democrats who served, got appointed to the Public Safety Committee. Then all of a sudden you started seeing measures pass the Public Safety Committee. And I think I told you somewhat at the time or otherwise that I asked Willie Brown why he was changing and letting so many public safety bills pass, and his response was, "I'm no idiot. I see the train coming. I don't want to stand in the middle of the tracks." And that was really because of this public safety concern and this impetus by three strikes law, you collecting signatures and moving forward with that, and really the public sentiment shifting to make crime and public safety such a high priority coming up into that election in 1994.
Yeah, that's right. But that was almost 2.5 years after my sister died.
Yeah.
Remember that election took place.
Right.
And we brought the law in front of Willie Brown's legislature. I call it his legislature because it was his legislature in April of '93, and that's when we were told to take a hike. And so we decided, okay, we'll make it a ballot initiative. And the signature gathering was going fairly slowly until there was a very high-profile murder. It had national attention, and it was Polly Klaas who was killed, taken from her bedroom during a slumber party by this awful person who, again, poster child for recidivism laws. So why was this guy allowed to be out of prison given his record? You knew sooner or later he was going to kill somebody. And sure enough, he did. The public outrage at that point that's when the tipping point was, because it didn't happen in a minor media market. It happened in the Bay Area, and so we got.
That's something how you can say that and everyone says, okay, that makes sense, but how sad that is, right?
It is.
As people are, challenged by crime wherever they are. But unless, there's a media response to it, it doesn't necessarily move the public in a way that they need to be moved.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's a trail of blood, of victims that were unheralded by the media from the time my sister died up to the time that Polly Klaas's killer was found, It really is unfortunate, but that was a galvanizing point. And at that point we had no problem gathering signatures. Our problem was getting petitions out to people because we weren't paying for we were paying for signatures like they do nowadays.
Right.
What are they paying, like $12 a signature or something crazy?
Yes, exactly.
We didn't pay for signatures. We didn't have professional signature gatherers. It was literally a grassroots movement, kind of like the old Howard Jarvis Prop 13 thing, where there were just moms and dads and brothers and sisters that just, I was driving, carloads of paper all over the state to give out petitions to people. My dad was doing the same thing. We're on radio shows constantly. Some of the popular talk show hosts whose popularity endures through today, like John and Ken, and some of the people in KGO radio up in San Francisco.
Right.
Ray Appleton recently retired, but he was a big part of that in the Central Valley. And the signature started coming in, and then March 7th of 1994 was when we had the signing ceremony for the three strikes law that passed the legislature.
That's when Willie Brown got out of the middle of the tracks.
Willie Brown had gotten out of the way out of the track, gotten off the tracks,
right,
in hopes that we would not run the initiative. But we decided to run the initiative anyway because we felt it was very important for the public to have a say in this thing. So that election took place in November of '94.
So let's stop and just talk technically. So here these guys are collecting signatures. You're close to having enough to put the measure on the ballot, which was what, 500,000-600,000 at the time, or
Yeah, it was.
roughly?
I want to say we had over 700,000
Right. So
signatures.
that's a daunting effort,
Yeah,
and not paying someone else to stand in front of Costco and collect signatures. So the way it was being talked about at the time in Sacramento is, okay, if we pass this three strikes law, they get what they want, and then that measure is not on the ballot and could be used politically. Now, I mean, technically, there's a couple elements of that, isn't there? I mean, if it's a legislative action, the legislature can undo that action.
yeah. Well, and if it's a state constitutional amendment that's passed by the voters, the legislature can't undo it. Unfortunately, three strikes was
It was
not.
just a
It was just a statute.
statutory, yeah.
In retrospect, probably we should have made it a state constitutional
Because
amendment.
I think that next side of this, the next step in the story is the immediate desire to start by some to unravel the three strikes.
Yes, almost immediately. In fact, even between the passage of the law in March of '94 and the election in November of that year, which, by the way, we won 72-28.
Wow.
Yeah, imagine, was there a time when 72% of Californians agreed on something? Well, that was something.
Right.
And even during that time, we had a tremendous amount of negative press, and a lot of it very dishonest. There was the pizza thief. They would, some guy got sentenced to 25 years to life for stealing a bottle of cologne. Well, I mean, if you pistol whip somebody and take his cologne, that's not really stealing a bottle of cologne. They don't want to tell you that. They don't want to tell you what the guy's, criminal history was. What were his 14 triggering strikes before he was
Exactly.
sentenced for his third felony?
Exactly.
And so we had a lot of that sort of dishonest reporting. But
And sadly, a lot of subsequent steps have not only changed that law, but changed many others in California. And I want to briefly touch on that.
Mhm.
But specifically, why I thought this, not only hearing from you, hearing your story, making sure people rehear, what was happening in 1994. For some reason, I have seen this great parallel now with crime rising, crime rates increasing, the public being much more focused on public safety as an issue as they contemplate, elections and other things. The 94 election, I would argue that Prop 184, the Three Strikes Initiative, was one of the reasons why there was such a tremendous turnout in California, and really a Republican wave. I mean, that was the first time a Republican majority got elected in any house of the state assembly since 1972, I believe. But the point of the matter is that was an impetus to that voter action, and I just feel so much like this is a replay of that time. Public
Yeah,
safety's gotten out of control, and people are paying attention to things like public safety now, and that will have an impact on election.
yeah, I think it will. It's certainly unfortunate that um, it takes for crime getting out of control for people to remember the lessons
Right,
that we learned 30 years ago.
right.
Um, but it's better to learn the lesson at some point than to never learn it. Now, will this be the year that happens? Maybe, maybe not. Crime certainly has spiked in the last 2 years, but there's been a confluence of various poor policy decisions since 2011 that have all kind of converged in the last 2 years to create this unprecedented spike in crime. And when if you rewind back to 1992 when my sister was killed, in 1994, which was late 93, early 94, when the crime rates reached their peak in this state, they had been rising steadily for over a decade. Really since we're almost 2 decades. They've been rising steadily and gotten to this awful point. And they dropped off for almost 20 years while we were locking up the right
Enforcing the
people.
law,
Yeah,
yeah,
we're
right.
enforcing the law and locking the bad guys up for long periods of time. Then in 2011, we had AB 109, which was the realignment that Jerry Brown did as his reaction to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision on prison overcrowding. The Ninth Circuit didn't say you have to let people out of prison. It just said you can't have this many people in this many cells.
So really, how that worked is the governor pushed a
Yeah.
lot of state prisoners, people who were convicted of crimes that had more than 1 year of incarceration required, pushed them out of state prison into
And
local county
put them
jails
into county jails,
that
and
didn't have space.
that didn't have space exactly. And so he basically solved the prison overcrowding problem by shifting it into the counties,
Right.
right? And rather than building more prisons, which is what they should have done, because public safety is more important than saving a few bucks on prisons.
Yes.
And so when your county jails are filled up with hardened prisoners, you don't have the ability to temporarily house criminal defendants and people who've been charged with crimes, and you don't have the ability to give people 1 year sentences or less than a year sentence for relatively minor crimes, and so those crimes end up not getting punished at all. Then you go to 2012 and you have Prop 36, which takes away the triggering felony requirement on three strikes and converts it from any felony to only violent felonies will suffice to trigger the third strike. Well, that shifts the balance of power in favor of the criminals and against the victims, because if you're going to say we're not going to put somebody behind bars until they've committed a third violent felony, that means we're comfortable as a society with a third victim of a violent felony. That means that decision is going to be paid in blood by the victim of that violent felony. And it's not going to be somebody that's in the legislature who's making that decision. It's going to be somebody on the street like you or me. Then you've got Prop 47 in 2014, the quote-unquote Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. I love how the Attorney General gets in charge of title and summary on these things. They can call it whatever they want, right? But that let a lot of people out of jail, unfortunately. Then you had
Which is probably defined as one of the main reasons homelessness spiked.
Yeah.
After 2014.
Well, it almost decriminalized property crimes, because what it did was it converted a lot of the property crimes that previously were felonies into misdemeanors.
Yeah.
Now, it didn't have the immediate result of spiking property crimes, because you don't get that until you have DAs who were progressive DAs like Boudin and Gascon, who are refusing to prosecute misdemeanors.
Right.
Well, at that point, okay, if you've got if most of your property crime felonies have been converted to misdemeanors and your DAs aren't prosecuting misdemeanors, or they're not seeking jail time for misdemeanors, you've effectively decriminalized property crimes. So, like I said, a confluence of multiple things that came together. And then you had Prop 57 in 2016. You had COVID, where you had
Early
the government
release of a lot of
releasing
people.
all these prisoners because of COVID.
So now you're painting a very dismal story and a sad one. So, I know there's been attempts to put initiatives on the ballot to switch back some of those things, and none of those initiatives were successful. So people aren't going to see those on this November ballot, but they are going to see a lot of people and a lot of names. And I guess one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is it really is an inspiring story. Someone who went through a tragedy in a family that stepped up and said, we have to respond. And how you responded, saved, hundreds, if not thousands of lives in California or across the country as others mimicked, those types of laws. And even though today we find ourselves in a challenging spot in terms of public safety, that those challenges are met when individuals get involved, as you demonstrated. And I think where everybody can demonstrate in this coming November, and looking into those issues and looking into candidates support their philosophy on those issues. So, Michael, it's very nice that you gave us some time to talk today and sharing your story and really your knowledge in this area.
Oh, thanks. And it's great to see you again, and I appreciate you inviting me on.
Thanks, Michael.